Hello, my name is Dr. Phil Garrison, and I'm an adjunct professor at the Pacific College of Oriental Medicine in San Diego. Today, I've invited Stephen Boyanton to speak with us about his PhD research on the Shang Han Lun. Stephen is the Director of Education and Sinological Research at the Xinglin Institute, and he is currently completing his PhD in the Department of East Asian Language and Culture at Columbia University in New York. The reason why I asked him to speak with us is because his doctoral research focuses on the Shang Han Lun. And he's actually working on something that's rather interesting in the sense that many of us typically think of the Shang Han Lun as seeing a revival or a renaissance during the Song dynasty. And what Dr. Boyanton has argued is that the Shang Han Lun didn't actually experience a renaissance. What happened was it shifted from being one of a number of texts on cold damage, or Shang Han, to being the authoritative text on cold damage during the Song dynasty. I'd also like to mention that Stephen will be teaching a Shang Han Lun and Jinghui course starting very shortly. It's going to be several years in length and will cover the Shang Han Lun and Jinghui Yaolui in depth. So thank you for speaking with us. I look forward to what you have to offer.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So the first question I had was, as I noted in the introduction, your research focuses on the Shang Han Lun in sort of the overall context of Chinese medicine prior to the Song and then after the Song dynasty. Can you explain why the Shang Han Lun became the authoritative text on cold damage?
I can do my best. That's essentially the question that my dissertation is answering, and so it's a very complex question. And I would note it's even more than just the authority on cold damage, because what happens over the course of the Southern Song, Jin and Yuan dynasties that follow the early Northern Song dynasty is that the Shang Han Lun comes to be seen as a text that includes the principles for treating all illnesses within it. And in some ways, that's sort of what I'm tracing out in my dissertation, is this transformation from being up through the tongue, one among many, albeit a very highly valued one among many, cold damage texts, through becoming the cold damage text almost exclusively, and then ultimately becoming really the foundation of all herbal treatment of any sort. So briefly put, there are three major factors at work here. One of them that's been discussed already in literature in some detail is epidemiology. And what happens in China in around the beginning of the Song, but really from the late Tang into the Song, is you have two things going on at the same time. First of all, the absolute population has increased in a substantial and important way. And secondly, the population's locus, its sort of center, has shifted from the North China Plains south of the Yangtze River, well, really the Yangtze River Delta and the areas around that area. This has a couple of important consequences. The absolute population increase is important because, as we know, when population reaches a certain level and density, you can sustain ongoing epidemic disease in a way you simply couldn't in the past, and the epidemic burden of the society is going to increase. And in fact, a Columbia epidemiologist, Alfredo Moravia, has shown recently that given the best information we have on the number of epidemics that occurred in Chinese history, which admittedly is not very good information, to be honest. We know that a lot of stuff is not captured in the historical record, but given what we know, that the pattern they present is exactly what modern epidemiological models would predict for an agrarian population undergoing the kind of population expansion the Song was undergoing. So it very clearly shows that we have an increased epidemic burden because of the increased population. You add to that the fact that South China has a subtropical climate, and therefore has a host of illnesses endemic to it that are not characteristic of North China, including such things as malaria. So put these two together, and it's no surprise that the Song saw a dramatic increase in the number of epidemic illnesses. And the work of people like Miyashita Saburo and Asaf Goldschmidt has already shown that this was a factor influencing the development of medicine this time. And one of the reasons why the Shang Han Lun book was, well, why cold damage studies, we should say, became important. Because cold damage was the rubric under which epidemic febrile illness was usually conceived prior to up to the Song, really. Regardless of whether it was a warm disease or a cold, direct cold damage, it was all considered cold damage, and that was how you thought about epidemic febrile illness, basically. So that's one factor. A second factor going on is a shift in the social structure of Chinese society at the time. And this is more important than people have realized, because what happens is the Tang is dominated by a group of great clans who are a true aristocracy. What that means is, if you're born to a great clan, you're a member of a great clan. That's all there is to it. If you're not born to the great clan, you are not a member of a great clan. You can't rise into the aristocracy. You're in it or you're not. And the aristocracy was quite small. And so they essentially had a bargain with the government, whereby in exchange for their loyalty, the Tang government was essentially seeing to it that their status was maintained. This also was combined with a whole bunch of cultural factors as well, but suffice to say that if you were part of the aristocracy in the Tang, you were well off. Didn't have to worry about much. This all changes because in the end of the Tang, the warfare that goes on decimates the great clans. They lose their support from the imperial government because it's gone. They've already lost or given up their own sort of economic base in the provinces. So they don't have anything to support them there. And when all chaos breaks loose, add to that that many of the sort of generals running around waging wars had a grudge against the great clans. It's easy to see how they get wiped out. So by the early Song, there are probably survivors of the great clans who are still moving in elite circles, but they're by no means dominant anymore. And so a new elite has emerged. And what happens over time is this elite becomes what we would call a gentry, kind of like the gentlemen of England in, say, the 17th century, but very broad, much more numerous than the aristocracy ever was, and without any guarantee of their status. So to maintain your status, you had to do things that made you look like a member of the elite. Now, the big thing you had to do was to compete in the civil service exams through which the Song dynasty chose the officials who were going to help rule the empire. But the problem was, as the number of elite grew, the competition for these exams became unbelievably high. So that by the late Southern Song dynasty, we're talking about maybe 1% of the people who take the exams will succeed in getting an official position. So your odds are very low. And if you're coming from one of the more populous, prosperous regions, your odds are even lower because the competition is even more fierce. So because of this, no family could hope that every male in a family in every generation was going to succeed the way they could have in the Tang. So you had to find ways of employing your men who were not going to be in the exams. And one thing that emerges in this is one way of doing this is for elite men to become doctors. But that doesn't happen immediately because, unfortunately for them, doctors had a bad rap. All the way up through the Tang and into the early Song, doctors were low class and generally suspected of being all kinds of bad stuff. And so in the early song, becoming a doctor was something of a social risk. And you can see, particularly in the northern song, these doctors who are members of the elite going to great lengths to justify themselves, to argue why medicine is important. And what they draw upon, which is this is sort of our third point here, is that part of why this new elite that has emerged justifies itself on the idea that their kind of learning, based on study of texts, based on certain ethical guidelines about how to be a proper gentleman, et cetera, is the best way to do pretty much everything. And to their credit, they did a lot of amazing stuff. If you go back and look at the song history, they did a lot of very technically sophisticated work that you wouldn't think of a literatus, doing normally. And they were very sophisticated at this. But they turned their eye to medicine, many of them, as another example of how, under their guidance, things would be better, and how, as a demonstration, you could say, of their benevolence towards everyone else in society. That through their kindness and benevolence, they were going to benefit the world via medicine. There's a famous story about this very, very famous prime minister named Fan Zhongyan, that supposedly as a young man, he went to a fortune teller and asked if he could become a prime minister. And the fortune teller, who apparently was not very good, told him no, he was never going to become prime minister. So he says, well, can I become a good doctor? And the fortune teller says to him, nope, you're not going to become a good doctor either. And so Fan becomes very depressed. And his family is puzzled, and they say, well, why are you depressed? I mean, not becoming a prime minister, yeah, that's worth being depressed over, but who wants to be a doctor, And Fan says, it's true, for being able to benefit all under heaven, only the prime minister can do that. But at least a doctor can benefit some people. He says, now I can't be either of them. That's why I'm depressed. This led to this saying that people often attribute to Fan, although he didn't actually say it, but people often say he said it, that if you can't be a good official, at least be a good doctor. So culturally, we see also this shift towards valuing doctors. When we put all these things together, there's this new interest in medicine that's growing among the elite. And essentially, to put it in a nutshell, I know I've talked a lot already, but the sort of nutshell version of it is they were creating a form of medicine that was based upon literati modes of learning, literati ethical beliefs, etc. There was a literati medicine, as I call it in my dissertation, actually. And it turned out that the treatise on cold damage, the Shang Han Lun, was tremendously useful for doing that. And so, in my opinion, the essence of what makes the treatise on cold damage become so important is just that it was useful in forming this new form of medicine, literati medicine, which emerges in the song and then persists up to modern times as what we call Chinese medicine.
All right. Well, thanks. That was a great answer, and so much, so much in there. So, with regard to this literati medicine, what made the Shang Han Lun the preferred text over other texts at the time? For instance, like we think of Sun Sumya as a great physician from the Tang dynasty. What was it about the Shang Han Lun that elevated that book above the status of these other great works at the time?
It's a combination of factors. To begin with, Sun Sumya never stood a chance because the literati, especially of that time, wanted something they could trace back as far as possible historically, but still would be human, you could say. So, for example, I mean, the ultimate source they wanted to connect themselves to were the ancient sages, right? Because by saying that medicine, too, is a teaching of the ancient sages, you give it great status. The difficulty was that you needed someone who could be a bridge between you and those ancient sages. And to be a good bridge, they had to be very old. Sun Sumya was way too young to be good enough for that. You had to go to the Han Dynasty at least. But you also needed someone who was sort of, historically real enough to be someone you could be in connection with. Claiming that you as a Song Dynasty physician had a direct connection to Huang Di didn't work. He was too far away. You needed an intermediary between you and Huang Di. So who's going to do it? Well, Zhong Jing turns out to be perfect for the job because they know he's a historical figure. There's not a lot of records about him, but there's enough to prove he was there as a person. The records about him say he's a great physician, he does wonderful stuff, but he's not made to look like some sort of magic working miracle kind of guy, which Hua Tuo was, and that made Hua Tuo kind of less desirable because Hua Tuo, all these a contemporary of Zhong Jing, the stories about him are too unbelievable, so you can't really go back to him very easily in that sense. And on top of that, they already had a record in the preface of Huang Fumi's Zhenzhou Jiayi Jing, the systematic classic of acupuncture, sometimes called the AB classic of acupuncture, in which Huang Fumi, who was a near contemporary of Zhong Jing, discusses him and says specifically that he used the methods, that he adapted the methods from Yi Yin's canonical methods of decoction, Tang Ye Jing Fa, and expanded upon them. Well, Yi Yin is already sort of a minor sage, but it's always said that Yi Yin, of course, based his work on Shenlong. Shenlong's a big sage. So essentially, Zhong Jing is this wonderful link into the past by which you can establish your own continuity with ancient times. That was socially very desirable to do. That's one part of it. The other major part of it does have to do with what Zhong Jing is doing, because what upset Song literati broadly, not just the physicians, but all of them, about illness and medicine was they saw illness as being this ever-changing, always mutable, extraordinarily complex entity. And their concern was that contemporary physicians, who were not members of the elite, were practicing something far too simplistic. It couldn't possibly be good enough to handle this, protean, ever-changing, hydra-headed thing that was illness. So how do you deal with it? Well, that's the kind of picture that Zhong Jing gives as well. The Shang Han Lun, he's always showing how illness changes all the time and how you react to its changes. So it was this wonderful text they could use to directly learn how to deal with illness that's always changing. And it was particularly useful precisely because, unlike many other texts, because honestly, the other one they could have chosen would be the Huangdi Nei Jing, right? And in fact, there is another movement within Song medicine that develops mainly through people like Qian Yi, which then passes on to Zhang Yuansu and Li Gao later on. But much of what we think of as five viscera differentiation, Fangfu diagnosis, and this movement does draw on the Neijing heavily, although it does some very interesting things with that material. But the thing about the Neijing is, unless you're doing acupuncture, the Neijing does not give you any direct suggestions on what to do. You can draw principles from it, you can draw inspiration from it, but you're not going to find out what herbal formula to use to treat this particular set of symptoms. And the Shang Han Lun gives you that. So from the simple, both clinical practicality point of view, but also from the point of view of arguing against your competitors, the Shang Han Lun was a much better choice. Because whenever you saw a patient in China, up until the modern times actually, you weren't the only person there. There were a bunch of people who had been consulted probably. And the family themselves had some knowledge of medicine too, so they have their own opinions. So if you want to be the one they choose, the person they decide to go with, you've got to convince the family that you're right. And if you've got this very precise information from a classic text that everyone respects, that give you a stronger position. So there are a lot of reasons why the Shang Han Lun was very useful to these people and their arguments.
Great. Thanks. This information that you're providing is just so important, especially for Western practitioners, and I would argue particularly American practitioners or North American practitioners, because so many students at acupuncture and colleges of East Asian medicine simply don't have access to the wealth of material in Chinese that, you know, someone like yourself who's capable of accessing it via the language is able to provide. So thank you for sharing that piece. That's, you know, in my own research preparing my own classes for the Jingui and Shang Han Lun, you know, I've had to rely fairly heavily on English language scholars, and so far the information that you were presenting, I haven't seen anywhere else, and you know that's a wonderful gift to the West or the English speaking Chinese medicine community, I would say. So thank you for that.
Thank you
And
as well.
you know, it's
Useful.
yes, and you know, it's so interesting also what you've talked about in terms of gaining a patient's trust as a doctor. So part of what I seem to be hearing you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the Shang Han Lun gave scholars a way to kind of bring down some of the lofty theory that we might see in the Neijing and put it in a context that people could understand a little bit easier. It no longer became a debate on who could argue the wuxing or yin yang theory better. There were steps and signs that one was on the right track with regard to the Shang Han Lun. Is that roughly correct?
I wouldn't say it brought it down, because part of what made the Shang Han Lun useful was actually that it's a very hard text to read.
Mm-hmm.
And ordinary, you know, in the Song Dynasty, when there are no commentaries available at first, an ordinary, you know, untrained but literate person had almost no chance of reading it correctly. It took all the linguistic skills that the literati of the era possessed to read this text. And that was one of its useful, part of its usefulness to them was that it gave it a certain exclusiveness to them, right? You know, that guy over there who's a doctor but can't read very well, he can't argue with you because he can't read it very well.
Right.
But but also, but I think you're on the right idea that its advantage is that in a clinical argument, if you're arguing theory, and in my dissertation I actually cite case histories to show this. If you're arguing sort of basic theory, there is the potential for more argument, right? Because you know, theory is the kind of thing where you can argue it almost indefinitely, right? You know, someone says, well, but what about such and so, and the other one says, no, 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 they should be like this, and there's no definitive closure. But if you have something that you can cite that's very precise, you know, and that no one's going to argue with because you all accept it as being authoritative. So you can say, but no, look, Zhongjing says when in a yang mean disease, when there's fever and the patient is sweating, you know, urgently purge them. Then what can the other person say? You know, they could say something actually if they know the text well enough. But it's a much more definitive argument, and clinically, of course, it's also much more useful to you in the clinic. And I really think we shouldn't underestimate that.
Right.
That part of what's going on here is the Shang Han Lun is the model upon which what we now call Bianzheng Lunzhi is developed. What we now call pattern differentiation is developed. And this is how pattern differentiation was learned, by studying the Shang Han Lun. And quite bluntly, in my opinion, it is still the best way to learn it even now. If you learn it from the Shang Han Lun, you'll get it right. Other ways of learning that are not as effective, in my opinion, and many people in China share that belief.
Many people in the West do as well.